Something the size of a bus is falling through black water, and it's not falling by accident. Its heart slows on purpose. Its lungs collapse without panic. There is no light here, not even a trace. Yet it moves with certainty, yes. If it remembers a map no human has ever seen. A sound cuts through the pressure, sharp and violent, louder than anything your body could survive. That sound is not random. It's a decision. Somewhere ahead, something alive has just been located. And in that instant, a story that has been repeating for millions of years begins again. Far below, where sunlight has any say, long before satellites traced migration routes or underwater microphones, translated patterns into data. Sailors told uneasy stories about these depths, not because they had seen them clearly, but because they had seen the aftermath. Broken squid washed ashore. Massive shadows surface in only long enough to breathe before vanishing again. In the 18th and 19th centuries, when wooden ships pushed farther into open ocean, encounters became less mythical and more terrifyingly real. Crews didn't speak about ecosystems or acoustic mapping. They spoke about creatures that could shatter boats and disappear like ghosts. The sperm whale sat at the center of those accounts, not as a curiosity, but as something closer to an adversary. Whalers hunted them relentlessly, driven by the value hidden inside that enormous head spermaceti oil, a substance that burned clean and bright, lighting homes and fueling industry before electricity took over. Entire economies leaned on it. Ports grew rich. Ships left harbor knowing they might not return, and still they went. There's a record from that era, scattered across journals and logbooks, describing what happens when a sperm whale decides not to flee. A massive body turning with intent, the ocean going strangely quiet just before impact wood cracking, men thrown into freezing water. One of the most famous cases, the sinking of the whale ship Essex in 1820, still lingers because it doesn't fit neatly into human expectations. The whale didn't behave like prey. It behaved like something aware. But none of those sailors had any idea what was happening beneath the surface during the majority of that whale's life. They saw seconds. The animal lived hours in a place they couldn't reach. Drop down past the reach of light, and the rules change fast. Temperature drops. Pressure builds to levels that would crush unprotected human lungs instantly. Vision becomes useless. That's where this sperm whale is most at home, not visiting, living. Its body doesn't resist the depth. It adapts to it with precision. As it descends, the heart rate slows dramatically, conserving oxygen. Blood shifts toward essential organs. Muscles store oxygen in ways human tissues simply can't match. The lungs compress safely, avoiding the nitrogen issues that plague human divers. It's not improvising. This is built-in design, shaped over immense stretches of time. And then there's the head. For centuries, that massive structure confused observers. Why carry something so large, so heavy? Early theories were wrong, sometimes wildly so. It took much longer and better tools to understand that this head houses one of the most powerful biological sonar systems ever known. Inside is an organ filled with waxy liquid. When the whale produces clicks, those sounds are focused and projected forward like a beam. Not a gentle pulsar explosive acoustic blast. These clicks travel through water, strike objects, and bounce back. The returning echoes are processed by a brain larger than any other on Earth. The result is not just detection. It's detail, shape, distance, movement. Picture building. A three-dimensional understanding of your surroundings without ever seeing them. Not vaguely, precisely enough to hunt, because hunting is what brought that whale down into the dark in the first place. Somewhere ahead, moving slow, deliberate patterns, is a squid. Not the small kind people imagine. Something large enough to fight back. For a long time, humans didn't have direct evidence of these deep-sea encounters. Squid of that size rarely surfaced intact, but the whales told the story anyway, etched across their own bodies, circular scars, sometimes the size of dinner plates, patterned across their heads and flanks, marks left by suction cups lined with sharp edges, each one a record of resistance, a sign that the prey is not passive. By the time modern research vessels began capturing clearer images and recordings, the pattern was undeniable. These were not rare events. They were routine. When a sperm whale locks onto a target, its clicking pattern changes. Faster, tighter, focused. Researchers call this phase a buzz, a rapid sequence of pulses used to track movement in real time. It's the acoustic equivalent of closing in with full attention. The squid reacts. It has to. Tentacles extend, trying to latch onto the attacker. Those suction cups grip with force. In the dark, there is no audience for this fight. No surface disturbance to hint at what's happening below. Just pressure, motion, and contact. The whale doesn't rely on finesse. It has size, strength, and a mouth lined with heavy teeth designed to secure prey. The encounter is brief compared to the long descent that led to it. Violent, efficient, and then it's over. What remains are scars that will stay for years, maybe for life. Not as decoration, but as evidence of a place where survival is always contested. Back at the surface, centuries ago, a whaling crew might have seen those scars without understanding them. They would have speculated, maybe exaggerated, maybe guessed at monsters locked in endless combat. In a way, they weren't entirely wrong. They just lacked the context. What they also couldn't see was what happened after the hunt. The whale doesn't live alone. It returns to something structured, something social, in a way that complicates the idea of it being just a solitary giant. Groups form, mostly led by experienced females. These aren't random gatherings. They hold together over years, even decades. Knowledge moves through them: roots, feeding grounds, dangers. A calf born into one of these groups doesn't just grow physically. It learns. And learning in this environment is the difference between finding food and disappearing into the dark without a trace. The surface might look empty. It isn't. It never was. The ocean doesn't announce these groups. No visible borders, no markers, nothing that says this space belongs to them. Still, they move as if boundaries exist, guided by memory more than instinct alone. A young calf stays close, not because it understands the risks, but because everything around it is unfamiliar and immense. The adults don't rush. Their pace feels measured, almost patient, like they've done this thousands of times and don't need to prove anything. Whalers from earlier centuries noticed something unusual when they targeted these groups. It wasn't just individual animals. Reacting it was coordinated. When danger appeared, the whales didn't scatter immediately. Sometimes they formed defensive circles. Calves positioned toward the center, adults facing outward. There are written accounts describing this behavior with a mix of admiration and frustration. It made hunting harder. It also made the animals seem less like targets and more like something organized. At the time, the idea that whales might have complex social structures wasn't widely accepted. Animals were often reduced to simple categories: predator, prey, resource. the deeper layers of behavior weren't the focus. Survival and profit were. Still, those observations stayed in the margins of journals, waiting for someone to connect them later. It took microphones lowered into the water decades later for another piece of the puzzle to surface. The sounds weren't random. Not just the powerful clicks used for hunting, but patterns, rhythmic sequences, repeated structures that didn't match the chaos of the environment. Researchers started cataloging them, recording hours upon hours of underwater audio. At first, it sounded like noise with occasional repetition. Then patterns began to stand out. Some sequences had 3 clicks, others 4, sometimes more. The spacing between them varied in ways that didn't seem accidental. What changed everything was the realization that different groups used different patterns consistently. Not occasionally, consistently. A group in one region would favor a certain rhythm, while another group in a different part of the ocean would use something entirely distinct. These weren't isolated quirks. They were shared within groups and passed on. That's where the word culture started to enter the conversation, not in the human sense of art or written language, but in the idea of learned behavior transmitted across generations. A calf doesn't invent these patterns. It absorbs them, repeats them, becomes part of that acoustic identity. This creates something unexpected. Clans, not defined by physical barriers, but by sound, by shared patterns of communication that act almost like a signature. 2 groups might cross paths and still remain distinct, each carrying its own dialect. It complicates things, because once you accept that these animals are learning from each other, storing information, and expressing it through structured sound, the old image of a simple marine predator starts to fall apart. Their brains offer another clue, not just large in size, but with regions associated with social processing and memory that are unusually developed. That doesn't automatically translate into human-like thinking, and it shouldn't be forced into that comparison. Still, it suggests something layered, something that goes beyond reflex. There's a moment, often missed in quick summaries, where behavior and environment intersect in a way that feels almost invisible. While one group dives to hunt, another remains closer to the surface, keeping watch over It's not random rotation. It's coordinated enough to imply understanding of roles, even if we don't fully grasp how those roles are decided. Time moves differently for them. Gestation lasts well over a year. Years can pass between births. That slow pace means recovery from loss is equally slow. It also means that knowledge has time to settle, to be reinforced, to become part of the group's identity. Meanwhile, human activity kept pressing in. The demand for spermaceti oil didn't just shape economies, it reshaped populations. By the 19th century, large-scale hunting had already reduced numbers significantly. Some regions saw drastic declines. Crews traveled farther, stayed out longer, pushing into waters that hadn't been heavily exploited before. There's a contradiction buried in that history. The same species, the powered industrial growth, was being pushed toward collapse by that very demand. At the time, the long-term consequences weren't the focus. Immediate value was, by the late 20th century, attitudes began to shift. Regulations appeared. A global moratorium on commercial whaling marked a turning point, at least on paper. Populations started to recover in some areas, though not uniformly. The threats didn't disappear. They changed shape. Shipping traffic increased, bringing noise into environments where sound is everything. Large vessels crossing migration routes introduced the risk of collision. Plastic waste entered the water, breaking down into forms that don't simply vanish. Climate shifts altered food distribution, pushing prey into new patterns that whales have to adjust to. And still, they continue, diving, hunting, communicating. There's a research effort underway that tries to bridge a gap that once seemed impossible to cross. Instead of just recording whale sounds, scientists are using machine learning to analyze them, looking for structure, repetition, context, trying to answer a question that sits somewhere between biology and language. Is there meaning we can interpret? The process isn't straightforward. Human language comes with assumptions, grammar, syntax, shared reference points. Whale communication doesn't have to follow those same rules. Forcing it into that framework might miss the point entirely. Still, patterns exist, and patterns invite investigation. Thousands of hours of audio feed into algorithms designed to detect relationships, which sounds occur during certain behaviors, how individuals respond to each other, whether sequences change depending on context. It's early. No one is translating full sentences. But the idea that these sounds carry layered information is becoming harder to dismiss. And that leads to a quiet but persistent question. If these whales are communicating in structured ways, learning from each other, and maintaining group identities over long periods, how much of their world are we still not seeing? Because most of their lives happen out of reach. Not hidden deliberately, just inaccessible. The surface shows almost nothing. A breath, a brief arc of a back, then gone again. Everything else unfolds in darkness. There's another layer to their existence that doesn't reveal itself through sound or behavior, at least not immediately. It shows up in something smaller, almost invisible microscopic life drifting near the ocean's surface. For a long time, that connection wasn't obvious. Whales were seen as part of a chain. They eat, they move, they exist within the system. Nothing more. That view started to shift when researchers looked closely at nutrient cycles, not abstractly, but physically tracking how materials move through the ocean. A sperm whale dives deep, feeds in regions where light doesn't reach, then returns to the surface to breathe. That vertical movement isn't just about oxygen. It transports nutrients upward. Iron, nitrogen, elements that don't stay evenly distributed get carried into zones where phytoplankton live. These microscopic organisms rely on those nutrients to grow, and they matter far beyond their size. They produce a significant portion of the oxygen in Earth's atmosphere and absorb carbon dioxide in the process. So when whales feed and return to the surface, they're not just surviving. They're influencing productivity, encouraging the growth of organisms that affect air composition on a global scale. It's not intentional. There's no awareness of climate regulation in their behavior. Still, the effect exists. Remove enough whales, and that cycle weakens. Leave them in place, and it continues. This wasn't part of the conversation centuries ago. Whalers didn't talk about nutrient distribution or carbon capture. They talked about yields, barrels of oil, profit margins, risk versus reward. Now, looking back, it's difficult to ignore the scale of what was removed. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of sperm whales were killed during peak hunting periods. In some regions, populations were pushed dangerously low. Recovery isn't simple, with long gestation periods and extended care for calves. Population growth is slow, even under stable conditions. Add modern threats, noise, pollution, ship strikes, plastic ingestion, and the process becomes even more uneven. There's a tendency to frame this as a story with a clear turning point: past exploitation, present awareness, future protection. Reality doesn't line up that cleanly. Protection measures exist, Yes, so do ongoing pressures that don't always get the same attention. Noise is one of the more subtle ones. In a world where sound is the primary sense, increasing background noise changes everything. Communication ranges shrink. Hunting efficiency can drop. Signals that once traveled long distances get lost or distorted. Imagine trying to navigate your environment while someone constantly raises the volume around you. Not briefly, but continuously. Then there's the matter of space. Shipping lanes cut across migration paths, not because anyone planned it that way specifically for whales, but because global trade expanded. The ocean became busier, faster, less forgiving. Despite all of that, sperm whales persist. They keep diving into depths that remain largely unexplored by humans. They keep passing down patterns of communication that we're only beginning to recognize as structured. They keep forming groups that rely on shared knowledge rather than isolated instinct. And they do it mostly out of sight. There's something unsettling about that, not in a threatening way, but in how it challenges assumptions. For a long time, intelligence was measured against human standards. Language had to look familiar. Social structures had to resemble ours. Anything outside that framework was considered simpler. Sperm whales don't fit neatly into those categories. Their world is built around pressure, darkness, and sound. Their interactions happen in spaces we can't easily observe. Their communication doesn't translate directly. That doesn't make it lesser. It makes it different in ways that are harder to interpret. The question that started this weather, they are the most enigmatic creatures on the planet, doesn't have a clean answer. It depends on what enigmatic means. If it's about size, there are other giants. If it's about depth, other species go just as far. If it's about intelligence, comparisons become complicated quickly. But if it's about how much remains unknown despite centuries of contact, despite modern technology, despite all the data collected so far, they're near the top of that list. Because even now, most of what they do happens where we can't follow. And maybe that's part of why they hold attention. Not because they're completely hidden, but because they're partially visible. Enough to raise questions. Not enough to settle them. If you've made it this far, there's probably something about that unknown that sticks with you. Maybe it's the idea of communication happening just out of reach, or the thought that entire social systems exist in a space we barely understand. If you feel like sharing, I'd actually like to hear what part caught your attention the most. Not in a generic way, just honestly. Was it the deep dives, the battles with squid, the way they organize themselves, or something else entirely? People watching this bring different perspectives, and those details matter more than a quick comment. And if you've ever had an experience with the ocean divine, sailing, even just observing from the shore, drop that into those stories. Add something real to this space, something that doesn't come from a script. If you want to keep exploring topics like this, staying around the channel helps more than it seems. Subscribing isn't just a number on a screen, it's what keeps these kinds of deep, slower explorations going without needing to rush or simplify everything. And if there's something you've been curious about, some animal, behavior, or place you think deserves this kind of attention, say it. There's room to build future videos around what people actually care about, not just what's trending for a week. Before the next one, if you can, send me your last 3 scripts. That way the next piece can avoid repeating patterns and stay as original as possible.